Next up, we will hear from Derek Yao, who's currently a practicing professional engineer with TransLink, Vancouver's regional transportation authority, specializing in both transit and non-transit oriented active transportation facility planning. He's concurrently a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University in Health Sciences, where Derek's research lies at the meeting point of race and cycling. Thanks, Derek. Please take it away.
Hi, I haven't been muted. How much time do I have, by the way? I don't want to go too over. Do we have a time limit?
Yeah. Would you be able to keep your presentation to 10 minutes?
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay.
Wait, how long? Wait. Let me wait a second.
I can aim for like 15.
You can do your best, and we'll just maybe cut into the break if we need to.
Right, 15 is fine there.
Okay. I'll be as concise as possible. Hi, good morning or good afternoon. It's morning here in Vancouver. Good afternoon or good evening from wherever you're joining us from. Nice to be with you here today. This is the largest group I've ever presented to, even if it's virtual. So I'm not sure how this is going to go, but I think it's going to be fine. My name is Derek. I'm a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Health Sciences at SFU, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the research I'm doing for my thesis. I'll say that I'm affiliated with Chatter Lab, which is run by my thesis supervisor, Dr. Megan Winters, who does a lot of research on cycling motivation here in the Vancouver region. Let me just move this out of the way. Hang on a second. This isn't working. Okay, I'll figure it out. Okay, so before I begin, I'll start off by saying that I come from an active transportation engineering background where I'm used to looking at images like these and assessing the viability of cycling and cycling infrastructure through a really hard lens, like physical safety and roadway geometry. And in that regard, we know a lot of what people like. There's been a lot of research on this that's come out in recent years. People like mode separation, people like traffic calm streets, etc. But unfortunately, I would say that a lot of us in the industry are flying a bit blind when it comes to more fulsome data on who's cycling and who's not cycling. And very importantly, the question of why. We don't really know much about these more nuanced reasoning as to why some people bike and some people don't. I'd say this is particularly the case when looking at this through the lens of equity and equity deserving groups. Cycling and race in particular is an area that hasn't received much research attention, especially in Canada, where we don't really have a culture of collecting this data. And there's not a lot of handy race disaggregated data available. We do have data products and tools like transportation surveys from different levels of government that give a sense of the general mode share and the general transportation culture within a region, for example. But there's still a question of how to incorporate things like race into these programs and into cycling research and cycling practice in general. So as a response to this, Pedal Poll, which I suspect many on this call are familiar with, was launched in 2021 by community groups and researchers looking to better understand who is riding bikes across Canada. And so Pedal Poll, for those who don't know, is a volunteer initiative to count bikes. This year, I believe it was to count bikes and mode share and micromobility. I wasn't actually involved this year. And the previous 2 years, it was to count the race of cyclists. So the 2021 data for Pedal Poll has been published. And my understanding is that the 2022 and 2023 data are currently under analysis. So Pedal Poll is among the only sources in Canada right now, or in Vancouver at least, available that provides racial cycling data. So in 2021, the installment of Pedal Poll saw over 1,000 volunteer counters at 259 locations in 68 communities across Canada, and over 79,000 cyclists were counted. And in addition to race, perceived age and perceived gender was also counted. So the 2021 data found that at count locations across Canada, about 3/4 of cyclists were perceived to be white. This, of course, has some regional variability, though in Vancouver, these are the results in Vancouver. The results, I would say, are fairly similar. This shows data from 9 count locations in the city, all located in central areas in or near the downtown core. So in Vancouver's case, I would say that the about 70% of white cyclists is notable due to the city's quote unquote non-visible minority rate of only about 45%. Also notable is the 10.6% of East Asian cyclists perceived, despite the fact that, for example, ethnic Chinese populations comprise about a quarter of the city's population, which is incidentally the largest reported ethnic group here, and one that may very well be underrepresented in cycling according to this data. So this racial gap is quite interesting. All this data is quite interesting. It's really good that we have this data. Something is better than nothing. Great. But some questions do still linger, I would say. There's this question of, it's still unclear who is and isn't cycling in Vancouver across the city, not just in downtown and adjacent areas. Pedal poll is great, but there's a question of the quality of the existing data. Is this quality of data good? Is visual perception a reliable research method in this case? And of course, there's a question of why is there this apparent racial discrepancy present in the cycling data? So my thesis intends to explore these questions a little bit more. Specifically, my objective is to better understand intersectional motivators and barriers to cycling among ethnic Chinese in Vancouver. Yes, I've decided to focus on Chinese populations for a variety of reasons, the main one being that large gap in population and cycling that I find very, very interesting. Also, I'm ethnic Chinese as well, and I think it's like a really cool opportunity to research my own community and to get involved in my own community. So yeah, I'm really excited to be doing this research. The research employs a mixed method approach with successive quantitative and qualitative phases. The first phase is to look at and understand the prevalence of ethnic Chinese people cycling in Vancouver. And the second qualitative phase is to conduct in-depth interviews with Chinese identifying people to understand both these soft and hard barriers to cycling that they face and to explore ways to overcome these barriers. So today, I'll share a little bit of some of the preliminary data that we just collected over this summer. So we collected data from July to September. I'm really glad this data collection phase is over because it was a very, very busy summer. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk about that today. So to understand the prevalence of cycling across the city, I had a team of research assistants count cyclists at 16 locations across Vancouver. So essentially what I did was I mirrored the pedal poll methodology, only for us, we had more locations and these locations were more geographically and spatially diverse than pedal poll. So using visual perception to assess and tally passing cyclists' race, we found that the racial makeup of cyclists to be quite similar to what Pedal Poll 2021 found. Let me turn on my laser pointer just in case I need it. So the preliminary results from 11 of 16 sites indicate that the vast majority of cyclists were perceived to be white at about 65%. This is followed by East Asians at about 70% and Latin American, Middle Eastern, and South Asian cyclists at about 4% each. So here is what that looks like graphed on that same scale as the pedal poll graph that I showed earlier. So the data looks pretty similar, pretty consistent. But I will caution that this racial breakdown can't really be generalized across the entire city, as we're seeing some stark differences between neighborhoods. For example, it appears that neighborhoods on the west side show a much larger overrepresentation of white cyclists. 81% of cyclists at this location, number 5 in the West Point Grey neighborhood, were white, while more ethnically mixed neighborhoods in the south and the southeast parts of the city show a breakdown more similar to that what can be seen across the general population. So recall that Vancouver's non-visible minority rate I mentioned earlier is about 45%, and this location here in the Killarney neighborhood shows that that non-visible minority rate at about 43%. So very similar to kind of the general population of Vancouver. One really huge asterisk here, of course, is goes back to the question I posed earlier about the quality and the reliability of our data collection method. Questions linger about whether or not visual perception is quote unquote good enough of a data collection method. And incidentally, when I've presented this research to other professional and academic groups, this seems to have been a fairly common critique of the visual perception methodology in general. So to address this, we actually developed a ground truthing, or in my mind, what I call kind of like a data validation exercise to accompany our cyclist counts. So what we did was we used 7 of the 16 previous count locations to do an experiment, essentially, where we compared a cyclist's self-identified race with their race as visually perceived by a group of observers. And this is the same set of observers used in the previous cyclist counts. And this was done in addition to the regular counts, not in place of the regular counts. So the purpose here is to validate, let's say, or at least qualify in some way the data collected from the first phase and from visual perception exercises like pedal pull in general. So this is what that setup looked like. What I had was a surveyor who randomly intercepted cyclists stopping at a red light along an established bike route here in Vancouver. The surveyor would ask the cyclist to identify their race. And at the same time, I had observers observe this interaction from a slight distance away, out of earshot of that interaction, and they would record the cyclist's race as visually perceived by them. And there was always a minimum of 2 observers, one white and one non-white, so that if I needed to, I could compare the 2 people's data directly. So I also had both of them, the surveyor and the observers, record the timestamp, the bike color, and the bike type, and the perceived gender, so that on the back end of things, I could match the 2 sets of data with relative ease. Overall, we had about an 84% response rate, which is like pretty good, and 523 valid intercepts were recorded. And from these intercepts, we got over 1,200 matchable observations made by my group of 7 observers. Those who are really into data might be interested to know that I'm analyzing this data using a confusion matrix, so-called, because I think it looks confusing. So basically, I'm plotting the observed race versus the cyclist's actual race, kind of like this. I use just this as an example using emoji animals. So basically, all matches between observed and actual races are considered correct, and all non-matches are considered incorrect. And from this, we can calculate other things like the accuracy and precision of the observers, both in aggregate and individually, and also the accuracy of the entire exercise or the entire model itself. So I stressed again that these are preliminary results only, and here's the 500 or so people that we intercepted and their self-identified races. Here's the precision and accuracy of our observers per the race of all these intercepted cyclists. You'll notice on the right that I grouped the observers by race, because the race of the actual observers, because something I wanted to look into was whether there was any noticeable difference in accuracy and precision between observers of different races themselves. And that's known as the cross-race effect, which hypothesizes that we are able to recognize people of the same race more precisely than people of a different race. So I wanted to see if that kind of translated to this exercise as well. I do want to note a few caveats here as well. Primarily cases where we had very few intercepts. This may make the precision seem artificially high or artificially low. So that's something to keep in mind as I continue to digest and analyze this data. But in general, what do the data show? What are the main takeaways here? For me, when I look at this data, I'm struck by the fact that precision in observing certain groups are consistently high across the entire group of observers. So in this case, East Asian and white cyclists were identified with high precision across the board. And I would say, kind of the opposite for certain other groups too. So Latin American and mixed race people were, for example, identified very low with a low rate of precision across the board as well. And maybe this makes sense because when you think about it, in Vancouver, white and East Asian people are the most prevalent racial groups. So perhaps for our observers, all of whom I believe have been living here for many years, or in some cases their entire lives, they're perhaps more tuned into what white and East Asian people, quote unquote, look like. So I mentioned the cross-race effect previously. With respect to that, I would say it isn't quite clear whether or not there was such an effect. And again, this is just preliminary results right now. So what I have highlighted here is the race of the cyclist given the race of the observer. And in some cases, observers could identify people of their own race with a lot higher precision than that of cyclists of a different race. So for example, for white observers, and in some cases, there was the opposite. So for our South Asian observers, they identified their own race at a much lower precision rate than other races. So that's quite interesting. Again, the caution here is that this is a sample size of only 7 observers, so definitely there's a risk of misinterpretation here, and certainly I would say more data is needed, and I would love to repeat this exercise with a lot more people in different parts of the country as well. But the data, right now, they do provide a really interesting snapshot of clues as to what's going on. So in terms of the main takeaways of the entire quantitative package so far, what would I say? Well, as I had mentioned previously, first of all, the data show that white cyclists appear to be overrepresented, with East Asian cyclists more prevalent in cities' ethnically mixed neighborhoods. Secondly, the precision in racial identification may be a function of the dominant racial culture and not really the race of the observers themselves, though, again, I'll say always that more data is needed. Is there a cross-race effect when it comes to observing cyclists? Based on the data, not really sure. It's not quite clear. Next, I would argue that using a racially diverse group of data collectors may help correct for imprecisions and potential bias in these types of exercises. And finally, there remains the question of whether or not visual perception is an appropriate method to collect racial cycling data. So in our exercise, the accuracy of our observers was in the 70 to 80% range. Is that good enough? Is that appropriate? And I would say ultimately it depends. It depends on, it's a question of the purpose of your research and the trade-offs that you're willing to accept. Visual perception, like the pure pedal pull methodology, is easier, it's quicker, it's easier to mobilize, it requires less human effort, but it gives you data that's like quite simple, that is a little bit clunky. And if the goal is to understand exactly the race of who's cycling, then the only way you're going to get around that is to intercept and survey every passing cyclist, which obviously takes more time and takes much a larger human effort. But the good thing in that case is that the data that you would get is much richer and much more nuanced. So ultimately, I'd say it depends on what you're looking for, what kind of error you're willing to accept, and what your resources are. So in terms of the next steps of my thesis, I'm done this quantitative phase, and I'm going to package that all together and bring it forward to my qualitative phase to inform the interviews that I'm going to be doing with Chinese identifying participants. I'm hoping to start that early next year, or maybe even later this year if my data analysis and data cleaning goes well over the next few months. And I think that's it. I wonder how I did for time. 16 minutes. I was okay. I'll close by...
You did fabulously well.
Okay, great.
Oh, did you want to say a last word?
Yeah, sure. I just want to close by plugging my lab group again, chatterlab.ca. We do a lot of interesting research that is used by both industry and researchers around the continent. So please give us a quick Google to take a look at some of the projects we're working on. And a really big thank you to my entire group of data collectors. I believe some of you are on the call right now. Thank you very much for your time and your effort. And if any of you on the call want to talk to me about how to analyze this data and want to help me do my work, Derek_Yao at sfu.ca. If you want to chat, always happy to. Oh, and if anyone wants to do this kind of exercise themselves, I have a lot of pointers to look out for. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I haven't been looking at the chat, so I don't know.
Awesome, Derek. Yeah, well, I have, and I want to give you a chance to respond to a couple of questions here. I'll give you both questions in a row, and you can answer them both.
Okay.
I think so. First question from Army de Francia. This is very detailed and nuanced. Curious to know what types of bike facilities were at the observation locations. And the next question from Madeline Bonsma Fisher. Amazing results. So happy to see this. Do you have a sense if there might be a bias in who responded or not to the intercept survey?
Right. Yes. Okay. These are great questions. The first question, what type of facilities? They were on a mix of facilities. So this image right here is, just a neighborhood bike route. We also did some intercepts on separated bike lanes and on bike paths. But the key, I remember when I was developing the methodology, was to get a geographic mix and a mix of infrastructures as well. So I believe that is covered in kind of what we did. The next question was, what was it again?
Is there non-response bias from
right.
people who refused to answer when they were intercepted?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too sure about that right now. I will say that anecdotally speaking, there was a there was a group of responders who seemed to have problems with responding, and the decline rate was a bit higher among some groups. One way that we thought to correct for kind of this selection bias of who's answering and who's not answering is we wanted to make our surveyors an ethnically and gender mix as well, in which I think we had several different races of surveyors and several and both genders or all genders of surveyors present. So we hope that would be able to correct for the bias in who was responding. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And feel free to type some answers. There's a couple more comments for you in the chat now. And sorry to rush you along or to give you the impression that we're rushing.